have with me today Pastor Jim Johnson from Preston Trail Community Church in Frisco, Texas. Say hello, Jim.
Hello, Matt. Nice to see you today.
Yes, it's good to connect with you. We are looking forward to hearing your story and learning more about your church, and it is kind of a unique place. You're a co-pastor with Paul Baisden. How did that come about? I mean, that's rare, right?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Paul and I had gotten to know each other during seminary days. After we graduated, we realized, hey, we didn't learn a lot about leading churches. So Paul was actually planning a church here in the Dallas area. And he recognized that some significant Christian leaders were coming by here. And so he said, hey, listen, why don't I try to reach out to them and see if they'd be willing to meet with some young seminary graduates who want to see their churches grow and thrive, and see if they'd spend 24 hours with us. And so we started doing that. And so there are about 5 of us. We called ourselves the North Texas Five, and we would meet on from a Thursday evening to a Friday evening. As we continued to see our relationship develop, Paul said, hey, listen, I want my kids to grow up knowing other pastors' kids and not kids in the church where I pastor. Would you consider going on vacation with us? And we said yes. And so it turns out that we vacationed with the Basins about 9 summers in a row. And so we got to know each other. But we never talked about planting a church together. We actually talked about how do you transition an inwardly facing church into becoming a more outwardly facing church, but never really talked about planting a church together.
So but when did that come about? What led to the planting
Yeah.
of the church?
Well, it was the summer of '01. He went to the Global Leadership Summit, and during the final session of that, there was kind of an opportunity for people to respond to how God might be leading. He felt like God was calling him to plant another church. But he realized, I don't have all the gifts that I need to really plant another one. And so while he was sitting there thinking, hey, God might be calling me to do this, I think I'll call Jim and see if he'd be willing to pray about planting with me. And that's what he did. We prayed for about 4 months and made a trip to the Frisco area the weekend after Thanksgiving in '01. But after our visit here to the Frisco area, we said, okay, we're in. And we decided to resign our churches together and come and plant a new church in Frisco.
Great. So you came to Texas, the intention to start the church together with this person who's become a close friend. That's a beautiful thing. You started meeting at the Stonebriar Mall. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. In the AMC Theater. We had just discovered that we would be 7th on the waiting list to plant a church in an elementary school in the Frisco area. And we were driving by the mall and I said, hey, there are some really good churches that were planted in theaters. Why don't we stop by and see if that might be a possibility? And we got there. The manager said, hey, we'd love to have you. And we were absolutely giddy because it was truly the focal point of all the growth here in North Texas, Frisco at that time. And so we were very excited to be able to land that place.
What did you do for classrooms, for space outside of worship service?
Well, we worshiped in one of the theaters. We set up our student ministry in one of the large hallways. And then when we launched and needed a children's ministry, we rented another theater as well, and we're able to use that space.
Wow, that is a lot of work, but it's an exciting way to start out for sure. So, okay, when did the first conversations start happening about moving out of that space into something more permanent?
We grew relatively quickly. We had 186 people on the first Sunday. We had 40 people on our launch team, and it was a great experience, and we kind of grew from there. And I would say in late 2003, we started going, okay, we don't want to do set up and take down for as longer than 2 or 3 years, at least in our minds. And so we reached out to Danny Musique at the time. I can't remember who gave me his name, but we reached out to him, and he was incredibly knowledgeable and helpful. And I will tell you the thing that was most helpful to us. We had big dreams. Hey, we're going to buy 30 acres. We're going to build a church there. And he said, hey, listen, I want you to do this. I want you to identify 3 banks and go and ask them how much money they will loan you. And so I think we were probably taking in about $600,000 a year at that time. And we went and talked to these bankers, and they said, well, we'll loan you three times your annual income. And we're going, well, 600,000 times three, that's 1.8 million. And we realized we couldn't build or buy 30 acres or build on it for $1.8 million. So that kind of changed our focus. And one of our key leaders, after a church meeting one day, said this: have you thought about looking for an interim space? And we said, well, we have, but the real challenge at that time was everything here in Frisco, we were on the northern edge of the growth. Everything was new. There were very few things or places that we could go and buy and transition them into a church. But not long after that, we found that there was this building. It was an old metal building, and they had manufactured circuit boards for large computers that came available. They actually went back to a bank. And so Danny helped us begin to put together a contract proposition for them, and he helped us secure that building. And it was wonderful, but it was nasty. We sold bonds instead of went to a bank, and we bought the building for 2.15 million, but we only had about $800,000 to renovate 46,000 square feet. That's $17 a square foot. So we didn't have a lot.
So going back to the conversation about identifying the banks that would give you a loan, what did Danny say when you came back with the lower amount?
We,
Did he change
I have a
plans?
great deal of respect for him because he could have just told us that.
Hmm.
And we would have gone, oh, come on, Danny, because we both had come from larger churches and we were going to go, hey, this is what we're going to do. But he allowed us to go through that process and to set those appointments and have those conversations. And once we had done that, we were pretty convinced, okay, we do have to change our focus for the time being.
Yeah, and when you say interim, you're talking about you still have the long range goal of 30 acres and a huge building, but you realized you're a few steps away from that.
I will tell you one of the things about this whole idea of an interim space. So we've been here now 23, 24 years, and there have been dozens of churches that were planted here in Frisco. And of all the churches that were planted from early 2000 to now, only about five or six have truly survived that time frame. And I will tell you the only reason why those churches survived is because they found an interim space. Those that did not find that space, they kind of died in elementary schools because they can never generate enough cash to get out of the elementary school to buy an interim space. Man, we had to stretch, but we got that interim space. And that interim space allowed us to grow from about 250 adults, about 425 total attendance with all the kids, to about 1,300 in worship. Plus, added total attendance that time was 2,000. So then we were able to buy our next piece of property and build our permanent location.
We're going to drill in a little bit onto the process of acquiring that interim space. So there's this computer chip factory, right? And you said it was
Right,
a
right.
mess. You didn't have a lot of resources to clean this place up. When you decided that this is the space for us, this is where we're going to go, it's within our price range. How did Danny guide you through those next steps to be able to make an offer?
Well, in that process, because it had gone back to the bank, we realized we were going to get it a little cheaper than normal. And so, quite frankly, we put together a proposal, we gave it to the bank, and I think we offered somewhere around 1.75 million. They were asking over 2 million, and they did not even dignify our proposal with a response. And so we just kind of waited. And then in late November, we got a call from the president of the bank. And he said, hey, if you'll bring me a contract for $2.15 million, we'll sell the property to you. And we'd done a capital project, and we had gained commitments for about 1.6 million. So we said, okay, we'll do that. So we brought the bank a contract, and they took a little bit of time to sign it and to respond back to us, but they finally did. And so we bought that property, 46,000 square feet, for $2.15 million, which was great, but it was nasty. And as it turns out, it was environmentally dirty. Don't know if you want to go
Yeah,
down
let's
this
go
road.
there. Let's go there because there's some important wisdom that I think
Okay.
other churches can
So,
learn. So what do you mean by environmentally dirty?
well, we did the typical, drill in the, in the foundation, below the foundation, to see if there's been any kind of a contamination of the soil beneath the building, and we passed all those. And so we closed on the building, and about 2 months later, a woman in our church came to me and said, "Hey, I was at this event that was sponsored by the Frisco Economic Development Council. And they said they were trying to buy that building. But when they did the testing, they found out that it was environmentally dirty." And I went, "Oh, really?" I said, "Tell me more." She said, "Well, the Frisco Economic Development Council might be able to help you." And because the Frisco Economic Development Council is a publicly held corporation, we could go there and get all of the information, the files between the city or the Economic Development Council and the bank to see what was going on. Well, sure enough, we got there. They pulled the whole file and we started reading through it, and we found, the environmental testing that the Frisco Economic Development Council had done, and they had done a wipe test and found that there were all kinds of heavy metals and lead on the surfaces. And also, we realized that in our contract with the bank, they were to present to us any and all environmental studies that they had done on that building, and they had not given that study to us. So we kind of had them between a rock and a hard place. And so we approached them and say, "Hey, what about this?" And after some more wrangling, some pressure that we had to put on the actual owner of the bank, they were willing to environmentally clean the building for us and also to provide some, I would say, some additional remuneration for the delay that it was causing in our building or renovation of the building. So
Yeah.
it was quite an experience to go through.
The key was in that contract, they said they had to do any and
Yeah.
all disclosures, correct?
Yes. Yes.
So you were able to go back to them after the closing and say, no, this contract did not meet the deal that
That's
we
right.
had. Right. Yeah.
Yes.
So did you actually have to file a suit or did they just respond to that
Well, that
request
is
directly?
how we put pressure on the owner of the bank. So we were dealing with the president of the bank, and he was dragging his feet, and it was to the point we were going to have to file suit. So we wrote the owner of the bank, and I wrote the letter and said basically this: "I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but your bank is about to be sued by a church for selling us an environmentally dirty building. You might want to talk to us." And so, yeah, he got in touch with us very quickly.
What was the temperature at the church? Were people excited about the move and wondering about the delay
Yeah,
or
people were
how did everybody
wonderful. I mean,
feel?
they were
Yeah.
loving doing the sweat equity. We had a bunch
Good.
of young dudes who wanted to get in there, and they were throwing stuff around, jumping through walls, to break down it was demo day, like
Demo
Chip
day.
and Joanna. I mean, we had a whole building to demo. So they loved it. But as soon as we found out it was dirty, then we had to stop. And so we put things on hold until we finally worked it out and got a company to come and truly clean every nook and cranny of that building.
Good. Well, things were taken care of. You received from remuneration for your loss, and you started growing pretty quickly after that.
Yes, it was pretty amazing. Uh, like I said, we were averaging about 400 people when we were in the theater, 225 on average adults, the rest kids. And we grew from that number to about 600 adults in worship within 6 to 7 months. So it was rapid growth very quickly. And what we discovered is, when you're in a temporary location, you're really only visible to the community maybe 3 hours a week. But when you have your own property and you can put a sign out front, it's amazing how many people will come just by drive by. But it's also amazing how many people will go, "Oh, now we feel like you're a legitimate church. You're not going to disappear. And so we had a larger number of people who are willing to invest in us and to say, hey, listen, I want to kind of place my family and my life here for a while and be a part of what God's doing here.
Okay, and as growth came, it was just a few short years before you were looking to move again. So how did those conversations begin?
Well, so we opened in 2007. We thought, hey, we'll probably be here, I would say anywhere from 5 to 8 years. That was our initial plan. We were 2 years later, essentially, we were trying to buy land, and our church at that time actually committed $2.5 million to buy land. And we thought, hey, within 6 months, we'll have a piece of property that we can take pictures of, show people. But with the recession hitting, we said, well, we don't want to buy anything now. Finally, in 2010, when things kind of settled and we were able to find a piece of property, a developer who was developing some property in East Frisco ran into a couple of roadblocks. There's a creek that ran through his property. It was going to cost a lot of money to build a bridge over that creek. And so he came to us and said, hey, I will sell you 50 acres for $2.5 million. Are you interested? And we said, heaven, yes. And so we negotiated with him, and he actually really gave us a good deal. We bought our acreage for less than the going rate at that time, and we're very grateful.
That's fantastic. How did the building project go after that?
It went really well. Now, this was around 2010, so we had to then walk through another capital project and raise money for it, and we were able to start construction on the new campus around 2000, at the end of 2012, maybe into early 2013. And our construction was completed in November of 2014. And that's when we moved into our kind of permanent facility in our minds.
All right. So just to sum up your journey, you planted a church, you started looking at properties, and you had the vision of the 30 acres in the building long down the road, but then connected with Church Realty, Danny and John. If you were to, just in a few sentences, describe how they kind of guided the growth of your church or the development of your church properties, what would you say?
Well, they were clearly very knowledgeable about real estate in general, and they were also very knowledgeable about the relationship between space and growth potential, which was also very helpful. And then, because Paul and I, our training was not in real estate or in finance. And so they were very, very helpful in terms of putting together the offers and helping us secure financing. And when we bought that first building from PC Dynamics and from the bank, we couldn't borrow enough money from a bank. So that's when we decided to sell church bonds. And that actually helped us stretch a little bit to be able to purchase what we needed to really get started.
Great. And lastly, what advice would you have to a pastor who maybe is just planted in a movie theater or some other small location, and they have that same 30-acre full building permanent home dream? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I work with a lot of church planters now, and I tell them, listen, the most important thing for you is probably to locate that interim space beyond the space where you launch. Whenever you have the opportunity to do that, take advantage of it, because it was getting into that interim space that really made our growth possible. And Paul and I both shudder to think where we would be today if we had not found that PC Dynamics building. And I'm sure, I would like to think that God would provide it another way for us, but more than half of church plants do not survive. So finding that interim space where you can take the next step of growth, and I believe is absolutely crucial for every church plant.